difference between internal elements and external elements in the skull. Firstly, 3 internal elements are unpaired. So we have anterior cranial fossa, 1 anterior cranial fossa, 1 middle cranial fossa, and 1 posterior cranial fossa. Contrariwise, all external elements are paired. So we have 2 temporal fossae, 2 infratemporal fossae, 2 pterygopalatine fossae, 2 orbits, and 2 nasal cavities. And secondly, in the cranial elements, we have only components and communications. All external elements, apart from this, all external elements have geometrical walls, no walls in the cranial cavity elements, and each external cranial element has its geometrical walls, and afterwards each wall consists of components, and we have communications. So just here inside the cranial cavity we have 3 unpaired fossae, cranial fossae, anterior, middle, and posterior. And on the exterior of the skull, on the lateral aspect, is the temporal fossa. The temporal fossa, which is continuous inferiorly with the infratemporal fossa, and this communication is just medial to the zygomatic arch, and afterwards the infratemporal fossa is continuous medially with the pterygopalatine fossa. This means that we have here like if capital letter L, its vertical component is composed of the temporal and infratemporal fossae, and its horizontal component is composed of the infratemporal and pterygopalatine fossae. Apart from this, on the anterior aspect of the skull, just in the middle are 2 nasal cavities. Superiorly, the 2 nasal cavities are flanked by 2 orbits, and inferiorly, 2 nasal cavities are flanked by 2 maxillary bodies in front and 2 pterygopalatine fossae. In other words, just the nasal cavities are between 2 orbits, 2 maxillary bodies, and 2 pterygopalatine fossae. This means that the medial wall of the orbit projects on the lateral. In other words, on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity project the orbit, the medial wall of orbit, the medial surface of the maxillary body and the medial wall of the pterygopalatine fossa. And just here we can see a temporal fossa which has its 3 geometrical walls. Such a wall here, which is being contoured, is the medial wall. All of this is the medial wall. The zygomatic arch comprises its lateral wall, and this part of the frontal process of zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of frontal bone offer the anterior wall of temporal fossa. Just inferiorly, the temporal fossa becomes the infratemporal fossa. So the infratemporal fossa must be medial to the ramus of mandible, like the temporal fossa is medial to the zygomatic arch. More deeply, the infratemporal fossa becomes the pterygopalatine fossa. And now we'll start with the internal cranial base, which is composed of 3 different fossae. All of this is the anterior cranial fossa. All of this is the middle cranial fossa and the posterior cranial fossa, because all 3 fossae refer to the internal cranial base. We should precisely bound them from each other. And so, where is the boundary between the anterior and middle cranial fossae? Such a boundary passes through the posterior margin on both sides, through the posterior margin of the lesser wing. Afterwards, the periphery, so margins of the anterior clinoid process, which refers to the lesser wing, and afterwards, the posterior margin of the anterior root of lesser wing. And in front, the anterior border of the chiasmatic or prechiasmatic sulcus. So just in the middle, we can see a groove for optic chiasma. It's called either chiasmatic groove or prechiasmatic groove. Such a depression, such a groove, is limited in front by a prominent ridge, osseous ridge. Such a ridge is called the sphenoidal limbus or limbus sphenoidalis. Limbus. Limbus means a very acute border margin. So, which is the posterior boundary of the anterior cranial fossa in the middle? It's composed of the anterior border, the so-called limbus sphenoidalis, of the chiasmatic groove. You should memorize that the lesser wing arises from the sphenoid's body due to 2 roots, anterior and posterior. The anterior root completely belongs to the anterior cranial fossa, whereas the posterior root of lesser wing belongs to the middle cranial fossa, and between two roots is the optic canal. The optic canal is completely involved in the middle cranial fossa. So the anterior root that belongs to the anterior cranial fossa is very weak, and in front it joins its counterpartner and together form the sphenoidal jugum. The sphenoidal jugum is just a kind of interconnection between two anterior roots of lesser wings. Everything else in front, referring to the sphenoid bone, is called the sphenoidal plane. It's very important, but in some books, sphenoidal jugum is used interchangeably with the sphenoidal limbus. Limbus is just sphenoidal jugum is interchangeably used with the sphenoidal plane. Sphenoidal plane is everything that belongs to the sphenoidal bone, its body. All this area, its very posterior part, refers to the sphenoidal jugum. So jugum is much smaller than the sphenoidal plane. And the posterior boundary of the sphenoidal jugum is the sphenoidal limbus, the posterior boundary of the anterior cranial fossa. The anterior root of lesser wing is very weak. Contrariwise, the posterior root is robust and has a special name, the optic strut. The optic strut, because it supports the anterior clinoid process. And just here, how about the boundary between the middle and posterior cranial fossa? So this boundary passes along the superior margin of the petrous temporal bone on both sides, but in the middle it refers to the posterior margin of the dorsum celli. The dorsum celli bears two posterior clinoid processes. So both the dorsum celli and two posterior clinoid processes are all involved in the middle cranial fossa. Contrariwise, the anterior clinoid processes refer to the anterior cranial fossa. So, as you can see, the middle cranial fossa is extended forwards until the sphenoidal limbus, and is extended backwards until the posterior boundary of the dorsal celli. Here is the anterior border of chiasmatic sulcus, and here posterior border of the dorsum celli. As you can see, the anterior cranial fossa is smallest in its surface area and shallowest. The middle cranial fossa is just both is just intermediate in both its size and depth. And the biggest and deepest is the posterior cranial fossa. Just here you can see that the exterior of the posterior cranial fossa closely corresponds to the interior. The external cranial base corresponds to the internal cranial base. But in front, it's completely different because the internal cranial base is above the nasal cavity and the external cranial base refers to the hard palate. So in front of the skull, the internal cranial base is widely separated from the hard palate by the height of the nasal cavity. It's extremely important. The nasal cavity is between the internal cranial base, between the anterior cranial fossa and the oral cavity. And just here in the middle, the internal cranial base is separated from the external cranial base by the sphenoid body. And just here, we can see a scheme referring to the anterior cranial fossa. As you can see, it mostly corresponds to two orbital parts of the frontal bone. Between both orbital parts projects the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And finally, the sphenoid bone. So with its lesser wings, but you should memorize that only anterior roots of lesser wings are included in the anterior cranial fossa, except for posterior roots and optic canal. No optic canal in the anterior cranial fossa. All three bones participating in the formation of the anterior cranial fossa are unpaired: frontal bone, ethmoid bone, and sphenoid bone. Such a surface of the sphenoid bone in the middle refers to the superior aspect of the sphenoid's body that's extended forwards and is called the sphenoidal plane. The sphenoidal plane, from its anteriorly, it gives us such an ethmoidal spine, such a spine that joins the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And now we should just concentrating on a real skull. So just what can we see here in the anterior cranial fossa? We can see lesser wings of the sphenoid bone with their anterior roots involved in the anterior cranial fossa. Apart from this, just in front of the anterior border of chiasmatic sulcus, the so-called sphenoidal limbus, is the sphenoidal plane. And here the ethmoid spine projects forwards to join the cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. Here we can see two orbital parts of the frontal bone. As you can see, they are very thin and translucent, transparent, and all these white grooves are just correspond to cerebral gyri, coils, cerebral gyri. All cerebral gyri are convex, so their negatives are called digitate impressions. So digitate impressions are extremely developed on the internal cranial base. The most conspicuous refer to the orbital parts of frontal bone. Now, we should always concentrate on different communications of the anterior cranial fossa with all corresponding topographic areas. And so I have a question. Can we see any foramina in the sphenoid body here that's involved in the anterior cranial fossa? No such foramina. Can we see any foramina in orbital parts of the frontal bone? No foramina there. The only foramina refer to this area because the cribriform plate is perforated by numerous foramina, some 30, 40 foramina on either side. One of them, the anterior most, is largest and is destined for the anterior ethmoidal triad. All remaining cribriform foramina transmit the olfactory nerves. So cribriform foramina communicate the anterior cranial fossa with the nasal cavity. Apart from this, just in front of the ethmoid bone, between it and the frontal bone in the middle, is a foramen that's called the foramen cecum. Cecum means just blind, but sometimes it may be open and then enters the nasal cavity. So through the cribriform foramina and the foramen and an optional foramen cecum, the anterior cranial cavity communicates with the nasal cavity. Apart from this, it communicates with the orbit, but through which foramina? Just here in front of the anterior lateral border of the cribriform plate, Oh, I'm sorry. So apart from this, we in the anterior cranial fossa, we have two posterior ethmoidal foramina that lead to the orbit. So the anterior ethmoidal foramen is just at the anterior lateral angle of the cribriform plate. This means that, and joins the orbit. This means that the anterior ethmoidal nerve passes transversely from the orbit to the anterior cranial fossa, and afterwards, through the cribriform plate, enters the nasal cavity. So no direct communication, only through the anterior cranial fossa, referring to the anterior ethmoidal canal. And here, as the place, posteriorly, we have as the lateral, as the posterolateral angle of the cribriform plate is the posterior ethmoidal foramen. Usually, it's invisible, it's implicit, because it's overlapped by the sphenoidal plane of the sphenoid body, and usually no foramen here, because just posterior ethmoidal nerve and vessels do not reach the anterior cranial fossa, but directly enter the posterior ethmoidal cells and sphenoidal sinus. But sometimes we can see the posterior ethmoidal foramen as well, that that's directed to the anterior cranial fossa. So here, anterior ethmoidal foramen, which is always present, and the posterior ethmoidal foramen, which is usually covered with the sphenoidal plane. So which interconnections refer to the anterior cranial fossa? Interconnections with the nasal cavity and with orbits. This is because just below the anterior cranial fossa, we have on both sides orbits, and in the middle, the nasal cavity. This means that such a part, orbital part of frontal bone, is at the same time the orbital fornix, and the cribriform plate is at the same time contributes to the nasal fornix. Just here, we can see the middle cranial fossa. One element is missing here. Here should be added the posterior root of lesser wing and optic canal above it, which belong to the middle cranial fossa. The biggest contribution to the middle cranial fossa refers to the internal surface of the sphenoid body, its superior surface, two lateral surfaces, and cerebral surfaces of greater wings. All these things, including the posterior root of lesser wing, which has a special name, optic strat, is a kind of support. But a verb to strat is rather negative, yes? And apart from this, so you should memorize that the superior surface of sphenoid's body is mostly included in the middle cranial fossa, apart from its very anterior part, which is plain, flat, and involved in the anterior cranial fossa. Both refer to the superior aspect of sphenoid's body. And apart from the sphenoid body, in the middle cranial fossa, we can see the anterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, temporal squama, and inferior most parts of the parietal bone. The second thing is which different foramina refer to the middle cranial fossa. So just here, the posterior root of lesser wing is missing. Above it is the optic canal. So the highest foramen in the middle cranial fossa refers to the optic canal. Optic canal communicates the middle cranial fossa with the orbit. The second thing is just here, such a place between the lesser wing, greater wing, and sphenoid's body. Such a triangular space is called the superior orbital fissure. Both the superior orbital fissure and the optic canal communicate with the orbit. Both are separated by the optic strut, so posterior root of lesser wing. You know that the middle cranial fossa comprises the greater wing. And so which foramina we have within the greater wing? Normally, we have three foramina along an arcuate line, like this. Arcuate line. The highest foramen is the foramen rotundum, and this one is foramen of Bailey, and the smallest foramen spinosum. As you can see, through both the foramen of Bailey and foramen spinosum, we can see the external cranial base, because both communicate with the infratemporal fossa. Contrariwise, the foramen rotundum is higher and medial in position. It does not open onto the external cranial base. It leads to the pterygopalatine fossa. This means that the foramen rotundum is visible from the superior perspective while viewing from above. And while looking at the external cranial base, we cannot see the foramen rotundum because it's deeply hidden in the pterygopalatine fossa. at the very beginning, I said that the pterygopalatine fossa is deep to the infratemporal fossa. And you can see two foramina of Bailey and spinosum communicate with the infratemporal fossa, and the foramen rotundum is medial, and so it must communicate with the pterygopalatine fossa. Normally, the greater wing has only 3 usual foramina, but sometimes it may be 2 more foramina. One just somewhat medial to the foramen of Bailey, through which transmits Vesalius vein. So it's called foramen venosum, transmitting a vein. And the other foramen is lateral to the foramen of Bailey and is destined for a nerve, lesser petrosal nerve. So it's called foramen petrosum. So sometimes the greater wing may have 5 foramina referring to an arcuate line from superior to inferior: foramen rotundum, foramen venosum, foramen of Bailey, and foramen spinosum. You know that the anterior surface of the petrous temporal bone is involved in the middle cranial fossa. On its anterior surface that slopes, we have 2 foramina that looks with their corresponding grooves look like pins with their heads. The bigger and more medial and superior structures refer to hiatus for greater petrosal nerve and sulcus for greater petrosal nerve. And such a foramen for greater petrosal nerve is at the same time a hole within the facial canal. Because of this, if you enter the foramen for greater petrosal nerve, you reach just the facial canal. And the facial canal has 2 endings. One leads to its beginning within the posterior cranial fossa, and the other ends in the stylomastoid foramen on the external cranial base. It's very important. Apart from this, we can see here a smaller foramen for lesser petrosal nerve. It's just a hole in the roof of the tympanic cavity, middle ear. So if you enter the foramen for lesser petrosal nerve, you will reach the tympanic cavity, middle ear. On the top of the petrous temporal bone is the internal opening of carotid canal, called the internal carotid foramen. The internal carotid foramen is just the internal opening of the carotid canal. Its beginning refers to the external cranial base, whereas the external carotid foramen. Apart from this, as you can see, the apex of the petrous temporal bone does not join the sphenoid's body. Here is just an irregular area that's normally in a living person is filled with cartilage. In macerated skulls, it presents an irregular foramen lacerum. Lacerum means just torn, foramen lacerum. And the foramen lacerum has two margins. Its anterior margin is composed of the posterior border of lesser wing, while its posterior border refers to the petrous temporal bone, its apex. Just on the anterior border of foramen lacerum is the posterior opening of pterygoid canal, Vidian canal, or pterygoid canal. Because of this, we cannot see that the foramen lacerum joins the middle cranial fossa with the external cranial base. We should say that the middle cranial fossa joins the pterygoid canal, which opens to the pterygopalatine fossa. So in fact, the foramen lacerum indirectly communicates the middle cranial fossa with the pterygopalatine fossa. This means that the middle cranial fossa communicates with the pterygopalatine fossa both directly through the foramen rotundum and indirectly through the foramen lacerum. Of course, all remaining foramina within the greater wing, that are foramen ovale, the more medial foramen venosum, the more lateral foramen petrosum, and foramen spinosum, all communicate with the infratemporal fossa. And all these things are here listed. And the posterior cranial fossa is composed by most of the occipital bone, with its basilar part, two orbital part, and the inferior occipital squama. Apart from this, here is the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. That's extremely steep. It looks like a vertical cliff. And a small contribution to the posterior cranial fossa refers to the mastoid angles of the parietal bone. And now we'll be concentrating on all holes of the posterior cranial fossa. The biggest one is the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum directly communicates with the vertebral canal. And we have just a separate skull. It joins the posterior cranial fossa with the external cranial base. As you can see, apart from the foramen magnum, either lateral part of the occipital bone is traversed by the hypoglossal canal. Two hypoglossal canals pass laterally and exit and appear on the external cranial base. Normally, they communicate the posterior cranial fossa with the parapharyngeal space. Apart from this, just no more foramina referring to the occipital bone. But we should now take into account the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, at which we can see the internal acoustic meatus that leads porous that leads to the internal acoustic meatus, ending in its floor, fundus, where we have 4 foramina. 3 foramina refer to the inner ear, and one of them refers the so-called facial area as the beginning of the facial canal. While entering the facial canal, will communicate with the middle cranial fossa through its hiatus, foramen for greater petrosal nerve. And finally, the facial canal exits the stylomastoid foramen on the external cranial base. On the posterior aspect of the petrous temporal bone is a kind of fissure, a slit, that's called external opening of vestibular aqueduct, which leads to the inner ear. And just here, where is the mastoid part, a small piece of mastoid part of temporal bone, is the mastoid foramen that exits the occiput. The occiput, exterior, the exterior of the skull. And this is a very important thing that is in between the occipital and petrous temporal bone. Here is just a foramen, jugular foramen, which is separated into 2 foramina, medial and lateral. The medial part is smaller and the lateral is larger. 2 parts of the jugular foramen. Both parts of the jugular foramen lead to the external cranial base, precisely to the parapharyngeal space, like does the hypoglossal canal. So through the hypoglossal canal passes hypoglossal nerve, through the medial part of jugular foramen, glossopharyngeal nerve, and through its lateral part, vagus and accessory nerves. And all these 4 nerves just enter the parapharyngeal space. And now all these things here, So the foramen magnum within the occipital bone. Just the hypoglossal canal that perforates transversely the lateral part of occipital bone, and internal acoustic meatus and pores, where starts the facial canal. And the facial canal, while passing through the petrous temporal bone, it forms three parts. The first part passes at right angle to the tangentially to the long axis of the petrous temporal bone in such manner, and gives and opens and has a foramen for greater petrosal nerve. Because of this, through the facial canal, the posterior cranial fossa communicates with the middle cranial fossa, passing with the whole course of the facial canal, will exit the stylomastoid foramen on the external cranial base. And here we can see the jugular foramen between the occipital and petrous temporal bones. Through its medial part, apart from nerves, through its medial part, smaller medial part passes the inferior petrosal sinus. Because of this, the medial part of the jugular foramen is called the petrosal part, and the lateral part is traversed by the sigmoid sinus. So the lateral part is called the sigmoid sinus. Just within the jugular foramen, the sigmoid sinus changes its name to the internal jugular vein. As you can see, we can distinguish 12 pairs of cranial nerves. To the anterior cranial fossa refer only the olfactory nerves. Nerves 1, olfactory nerves that pass through the cribriform plate. All cranial nerves, starting with the second and ending in the sixth, refer to the middle cranial fossa. And just so in the anterior cranial fossa, the cribriform foramina transmit the olfactory nerves. 1. Then we have the middle cranial fossa. The second nerve, optic nerve, passes through the optic canal. Through the superior orbital fissure pass the following cranial nerves. Third, oculomotor, fourth, trochlear, and sixth, abducent. Apart from this, the first branch of the trigeminal nerve, that's called the ophthalmic nerve. Through the foramen rotundum passes the second branch of trigeminal nerve, that's called the maxillary nerve. Through the foramen ovale passes the third part of trigeminal nerve, mandibular nerve. And all these nerves from the second to the sixth refer to the middle cranial fossa, all remaining nerves, so half cranial nerves. We have 12 pairs, and so precisely half nerves, cranial nerves, refer to the posterior cranial fossa. And so the facial nerve refers to the internal acoustic porous and meatus, as does the vestibulocochlear nerve number 8. So two nerves are to do with the internal acoustic porous and meatus, facial and vestibulocochlear. And just here, whereas the foramen rotundum pass 3 cranial nerves, its medial part, petrosal part, transmits nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, while its lateral, so sigmoid part, transmits 2 nerves, vagus and accessory. And the very last cranial nerve, that is hypoglossal, perforates the lateral part of the occipital bone. Now we'll be concentrating on the 5 external topographic elements on the exterior of the skull, and the very first visible on the lateral aspect norma lateralis of the skull is the temporal fossa with its large medial wall that refers to the temporal plane, its short lateral wall composed of the zygomatic arch, and its anterior wall composed of 2 reciprocal processes. So, zygomatic process of frontal bone and frontal process of zygomatic bone. 3 walls of the temporal fossa: medial, anterior, and lateral. This is something new, referring to the cranial fossae, because they now have geometrical walls. So the medial wall of the temporal fossa is composed of temporal squama, greater wing, its temporal surface, frontal squama, its temporal surface, and lowermost parts of the parietal bone. Can we see here any foramina in constituents of the medial wall? We cannot see here on the medial wall. No foramina on the medial wall. No foramina on the lateral wall. But you should remember that on the zygomatic body, its posterior temporal surface is a foramen, zygomatico-temporal foramen. This is because on the lateral wall of the orbit starts a Y-shaped canal with its zygomatico-orbital foramen. Afterwards, it splits into 2 rami. One of them ends in front of the zygomatic body in its zygomatico-facial foramen, and the other ends deeply in zygomatico-orbital foramen. Anyway, the temporal fossa communicates with the orbit through the zygomatico-temporal foramen. Apart from this, we can see that inferiorly, the whole temporal fossa passes freely downwards to communicate with the infratemporal fossa. And just here, just deep to the ramus of mandible, deep to it, is the infratemporal fossa. And the infratemporal fossa looks like a cuboid with no inferior wall. So this means that no floor in the infratemporal fossa. So it has just 5 walls. The lateral wall is composed of the ramus of mandible. The medial wall is just here. It's composed of the lateral pterygoid process, lateral plate of pterygoid process. We can say shortly, we can short this name, lateral pterygoid plate. So the medial wall, just in front of the medial wall is a doorway. It's a doorway leading deeply to the pterygopalatine fossa. Such a doorway is called the sphenomaxillary fissure or pterygomaxillary fissure. So the pterygomaxillary fissure is just in front of the medial wall and communicates the infratemporal fossa with the deeper positioned pterygopalatine fossa. The anterior wall is visible here. Such an area of the maxillary body that's called, all this area is posterior surface of the maxillary body or infratemporal surface, but only the posterolateral part of it corresponds to the infratemporal fossa, whereas the superomedial part is involved in the anterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa. So the infratemporal part surface of the maxillary body is involved in the formation two anterior walls, referring to both the infratemporal fossa and the pterygopalatine fossa. What's more, to these walls just end and limit from below the inferior orbital fissure, and afterwards they form the orbital floor. All constituents of the anterior walls of the infratemporal and pterygopalatine fossae become the orbital floor, above which is the inferior orbital fissure. This means that just directly in front of both the infratemporal and pterygopalatine fossae is the orbit through the inferior orbital fissure. What do we have here? Where is the superior wall of the infratemporal fossa? The superior wall will be visible on the next slide. So all this area referring to the external cranial base refers to the infratemporal fossa. All of this refers to the infratemporal fossa. So the superior wall of the infratemporal fossa is mostly composed in some 80% of its surface area by what? By the just this one, not this. This is temporal surface, only this area. The infratemporal surface of greater wing, 80%, with its foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, foramen venosum, and sometimes foramen petrosum. Some 20% is composed of this area. Such an area belongs to the temporal squama. So you can see that the temporal squama does not only refer to the lateral aspect of the skull. It's present on the external cranial base as well. Just by the way, both the mandibular fossa and articular tubercle belong to the temporal squama as well. So temporal squama refers, refers to both the medial wall of temporal fossa and the superior wall of the infratemporal fossa. Due to this 2, 3, or 4 foramina in the greater wing, the infratemporal fossa communicates with the middle cranial fossa. So all these foramina lead to the middle cranial fossa. We cannot see anywhere here the foramen rotundum. It's not exposed on the external cranial base. It's deeply positioned in the pterygopalatine fossa. Apart from this, the posterior wall of the infratemporal fossa is composed of the 3 processes. These 3 processes: condylar process of mandible, styloid process of temporal bone, and mastoid process of temporal bone as well. The posterior wall of the infratemporal fossa is composed of 3 processes: condylar of mandible, styloid, and mastoid of temporal bone. Which communications refer to the infratemporal fossa? You know that the lateral wall of the infratemporal fossa is provided by the mandibular ramus, on which is the mandibular foramen. Here starts the mandibular canal ending in the mental foramen. So due to the mandibular canal, the infratemporal fossa communicates with the chin. Just medially, in front of the medial wall that's composed of the lateral pterygoid plate, is a fissure leading sphenomaxillary or pterygomaxillary fissure leading to the pterygopalatine fossa. And directly forwards is the inferior orbital fissure joining the infratemporal fossa with the orbit. Apart from this, you know that in the superior direction, the infratemporal fossa freely communicates with the temporal fossa. And one more fissure, petrotympanic fissure. The petrotympanic fissure is just here, directly behind the condylar, the head of mandible, just here. And this area is involved in the infratemporal fossa. The petrotympanic fissure leads to the tympanic cavity, middle ear. From a legal point of view, the whole temporomandibular joint topographically belongs to the infratemporal fossa as well, because the posterior limitation of the temporal fossa, of the infratemporal fossa, refers just to these three processes. The posterior boundary is here, and the petrotympanic fissure is directly behind the temporomandibular joint. Can you see? The head of mandible is anteverted, like the femoral head and neck are anteverted as well. The humeral head is anteverted, and the condylar and the mandibular head is anteverted as well. The angle of its anteversion is some 30 degrees. The deepest topographical element that's deep to the infratemporal fossa is the pterygopalatine fossa. Some say that the pterygopalatine fossa is the deep part of the infratemporal fossa, and the remaining said that the infratemporal fossa is the superficial part of the pterygopalatine fossa. Who is right? I don't know. And the pterygopalatine fossa is just a conduit for neurovascular structures, referring to the nasal cavity, oral cavity, orbit, infratemporal cavity, and the middle cranial fossa. It's pyramidal in shape, so its base is quadrangular and directed upwards, while its apex is directed downwards. In such a pyramid, we cannot see the lateral wall because the lateral wall is lacking. It corresponds to a doorway presented by the pterygomaxillary fissure. Due to this, while viewing laterally with no lateral wall, we can see the medial wall of the pterygopalatine fossa, marked in blue here. In blue is marked the palatine bone. Only this area refers to the medial wall of the pterygopalatine fossa. So its medial wall is composed of the perpendicular plate of palatine bone and its sphenoidal process. Two parts of the palatine bone compose the medial wall of pterygopalatine fossa. The lateral wall is lacking. The superior wall is composed of the underside, inferior surface of sphenoid's body. It completes the sphenopalatine notch of a separate palatine bone. It converts it to sphenopalatine foramen. And such a foramen directly leads to the nasal cavity. So the sphenopalatine foramen joins the pterygopalatine fossa, or it'll be better, with the nasal cavity. The anterior wall is visible here. All of this forms the anterior wall. It's mostly composed of the superomedial part of maxillary body, with a small contribution from the orbital process of palatine bone. So anterior wall contains two elements: superomedial part of maxillary body, its temporal surface, its infratemporal surface, and orbital process of palatine bone. And these two elements both flex at right angle, flex forwards, and enter and form the orbital floor. So both the maxillary body and orbital process of palatine bone contribute to the inferior orbital wall, its fundus. And just above the anterior wall, so here, above the anterior wall is a wide fissure leading to the orbit, inferior orbital fissure. Due to the inferior orbital fissure, the pterygopalatine fossa directly communicates with the orbit. So medially with the nasal cavity, anteriorly with the orbit. Apart from this, on the posterior wall, we can see three different openings. The highest is the palatovaginal canal, which is a small canal that in front opens on the posterior wall of pterygopalatine fossa and posteriorly ends in the nasal cavity, its distal part, posterior part, close to the nasal part of pharynx. It's the so-called the nasopharyngeal meatus. Apart from this, just here is the foramen rotundum. The foramen rotundum is deep in position. It opens on the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa. Such a part refers to the maxillary surface of greater wing. So the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa is composed of the maxillary surface of greater wing superiorly and more distally by two plates of the anterior of the pterygoid process, which are fused with their anterior margins. And just below, so the maxillary surface of greater wing just overlaps the root of pterygoid process, and such a root is perforated by the pterygoid canal. On the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa, just below the foramen rotundum, so the lowermost opening refers to the pterygoid canal or Vidian canal. Its posterior opening such a canal passes sagittally and ends on the anterior border of the foramen lacerum, which offers an intercommunication with the middle cranial fossa. So just on the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa, three openings are in the vicinity from superior to inferior: palatovaginal canal, which is synonymous to pharyngeal canal, foramen rotundum, and pterygoid canal. And in the superior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa is composed of the inferior surface of sphenoid's body that's applied to the sphenopalatine foramen, thus converting it into the sphenopalatine notch, thus converting it to the sphenopalatine foramen. Apart from this, on the maxilla, on its tuber, we have just alveolar foramina, where starts canals, alveolar canals, ending in molar alveoli. So inferiorly, the pterygopalatine fossa tapers and forms the greater palatine canal, and the greater palatine canal perforates the pyramidal process of palatine bone, which is visible here, and it ends on it like to form the greater palatine foramen. And the greater palatine foramen canal gives us 2-3 smaller, lesser palatine canals ending in associated lesser palatine foramina. So all structures starting with the pterygopalatine fossa and passing inferiorly, exit 3 or 4 foramina on the inferior surface of pyramidal process of palatine bone. 1 greater palatine foramen and 2, 3 lesser palatine foramina. And the orbit. The orbit looks like a pyramid, the base of which forms the orbital opening. Its apex, such a pyramid, refers to the optic canal. So here is the apex. What's typical of the structure of the orbit? Apart from its base and apex, it has 4 walls. Medial wall, superior wall, just here, lateral wall, and the inferior wall. The medial wall is positioned completely in the sagittal plane. So this means that concerning 2 orbits, medial walls pass in parallel. The lateral wall is strongly oblique because it joins the medial wall at an angle of 45 degrees. 45 degrees. So it's neither frontal nor vertical, just in the middle. The superior wall or orbital fornix slopes posteriorly, and the floor is concave. So this means that's raised both medially and laterally. The superior wall of the orbit is composed of 2 components. The superior surfaces refer to the anterior cranial fossa. The bigger part refers to the orbital part of frontal bone, and the lesser posterior part refers to the lateral wing. The lateral wall is composed of 2 components as well. So this is the orbital surface of greater wing and the orbital surface of frontal process of zygomatic bone. The fundus, the orbital fundus or floor, is composed of 3 bones. So mostly all the maxillary body and maxillary and zygomatic body, and the third part is very small and positioned close to the just here. It's called the orbital process of the palatine bone. As you know, the orbital process of palatine bone has 3 surfaces. One surface is involved in the anterior wall of pterygopalatine fossa, while the other is involved in the orbital floor. And so It's just here. And the medial wall is composed of 4 components. From anterior to posterior, we have frontal process of maxilla. Frontal process of maxilla. Directly behind it is the lacrimal bone. Lacrimal bone. The third behind the lacrimal bone is the lamina papyracea. Papyracea means as thin as a paper because it's extremely fragile. It's just the lateral plate of the ethmoidal labyrinth. And the fourth most posterior part invisible here is the sphenoid's body before giving off lesser wings, a very small piece of sphenoid's body. So 4 elements. And I said that directly medial to the orbit is the nasal cavity. This means that the medial wall projects on the lateral nasal wall, except for a small piece of the sphenoid's body. So all these 3 things must be present on the lateral nasal wall: frontal process, lacrimal bone, and ethmoidal labyrinth. Which communications can we see here? So, do we have some holes referring to the superior wall? Yes, we have, because just here, the supraorbital margin is perforated by a canal ending in the supraorbital foramen. In some cases, we have infraorbital notch or foramen. If we have a foramen, we must have a canal, the same canal, supraorbital canal. Furthermore, medially, we may have either frontal notch or frontal foramen. If the frontal foramen is present, we have the frontal canal. The frontal canal. Through these 2 foramina, supraorbital and frontal, the orbit communicates with the forehead, Do we have any foramina just here, whereas the top of the orbit is the optic canal. The optic canal joins the orbit with the middle cranial fossa. On the medial wall, just above it, above the medial wall, above the ethmoidal labyrinth and the orbital part of frontal bone, we have 2 ethmoidal openings where start corresponding canals passing transversely. So anterior ethmoidal canal and posterior ethmoidal canal. The anterior ethmoidal canal medially ends in the anterior ethmoidal foramen, referring to the anterior cranial fossa, while the posterior ethmoidal canal is sporadically opened in the anterior cranial fossa. It's usually overlapped by the sphenoidal plane. Anyway, at least one, so anterior ethmoid through the anterior ethmoidal foramen, the orbit communicates with the anterior cranial fossa. Due to the posterior ethmoidal foramen, it communicates with the posterior ethmoidal cells and sphenoidal sinus. Just here on the lateral wall of the orbit is the zygomatic body, on which is the zygomatico-orbital foramen, where starts a Y-shaped canal. So here, the very beginning of such a canal refers to the zygomatico-orbital foramen. A simple canal soon afterwards bifurcates and opens in the zygomatico-facial foramen on the face and the zygomatico-temporal foramen, referring to the temporal fossa. And on the inferior surface of the orbit, we can see the infraorbital sulcus that deepens forwards and finally forms the infraorbital canal, ending in the infraorbital foramen. The infraorbital foramen communicates the orbit with the norma frontalis. Apart from this, some foramina are just between neighboring walls. And so, between the superior wall and the lateral wall of the orbit is the superior orbital fissure, leading to the middle cranial fossa. Middle cranial fossa, like does the optic canal. So all these two structures, optic canal and superior orbital fissure, are separated from each other by the posterior root of lesser wing, and both communicate with the middle cranial fossa. Contrariwise, the inferior orbital fissure does not refer to the cranial cavity. It exposes, it faces the external cranial base because it communicates medially, it communicates with the pterygopalatine fossa, and laterally it communicates with the infratemporal fossa. So the inferior orbital fissure is very wide and long in transverse projection. Medially, it projects on the pterygopalatine fossa, and laterally, it projects onto the infratemporal fossa. Apart from this, between the inferior and medial walls, we have the fossa for lacrimal gland. That's fossa for lacrimal sac, not gland. Fossa for lacrimal gland refers to the roof in its lateral part. So here is a fossa for lacrimal sac, which continues as the nasolacrimal canal. And the nasolacrimal canal passes vertically and opens in the nasal cavity, just in its inferior part, that's called inferior nasal meatus. And here is the same. Through the supraorbital, the orbit communicates through the supraorbital foramen and infraorbital foramen with the norma frontalis, through the zygomatico-orbital foramen with the temporal fossa and norma frontalis, through both the optic canal and superior orbital fissure with the middle cranial fossa, through the inferior orbital fissure with both the pterygopalatine and infratemporal fossae, and due to the anterior ethmoidal foramen with the anterior cranial fossa and posterior ethmoidal foramen with the posterior ethmoidal cells and sphenoidal sinus, and due to the nasolacrimal canal with the inferior nasal meatus. And the very last topographical element refers to the nasal cavity. In fact, we have two nasal cavities, right and left. While concerning on the skull, we are concentrating only on bony structures. The membranous structures will be involved while having the head and neck. To the nasal cavity, empty special spaces located in bones and just lined with mucosa. All these spaces, airy spaces, are called sinuses. Most sinuses empty into the middle nasal meatus. So we have two frontal sinuses, ethmoidal cells separated into anterior, middle, and posterior cells, two sphenoidal sinuses, and the biggest, two maxillary sinuses. This is the sagittal projection of the nasal cavity, where is visible the superior wall of the nasal cavity. All of this refers to the roof of the nasal cavity. In the middle, it's horizontal in position and slopes both in front and behind. The anterior slope is composed of the nasal bone in front, nasal spine, and nasal part of frontal bone. And its posterior slope is mostly composed of the anterior and inferior surfaces of the sphenoid body. Apart from this, posteriorly contribute to it vomerine ale, sphenoidal processes of palatine bones, and vaginal processes of the medial pterygoid plate. So here in the middle, where the roof is horizontal, is the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The inferior wall corresponds to the superior aspect of the hard palate. That's composed in front by the palatine process of maxilla. 75% of its anterior part is composed of the palatine process of maxilla. and its posterior 1/4 refers to the horizontal process of palatine bone. The medial wall of the nasal cavities is common for both nasal cavities, and so it's called the nasal septum, the osseous nasal septum. In its superior part, it's composed of the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone, and inferiorly it's composed of the vomer. As you can see, both form in front a notch. In all, the osseous septum just looks like a tenant flag. And the lateral wall is very sophisticated, but it becomes much easier if you remember that the lateral wall of the nasal cavity is medial to the orbit, to the pterygopalatine fossa, and to the maxillary body, because this means that all these components must be present on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So 3 elements that forms the medial wall of orbit are present here. So we can see here frontal process of maxilla. Its medial surface refers to the lateral nasal wall, while its lateral surface refers to the medial orbital wall. The next component is the lacrimal bone, present in both the medial orbital wall and here. And the next part refers to the ethmoidal labyrinth. Its lateral part, facing the orbit, is very frangible and called orbital plate, lamina papyracea. The medial plate of the ethmoidal labyrinth gives us 2 or 3 nasal conchae, turbinate. Middle nasal concha, superior nasal concha, and sometimes supreme nasal concha. Apart from this, the nasal cavity is positioned directly medial to the maxillary sinus. So all the surface visible here is the nasal surface of the maxillary body. Apart from this, on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, we can find only 2 completely new structures, like the posterior boundary of it is composed of the medial pterygoid process, and inferiorly is the inferior nasal concha, a completely separate bones. And now we'll be concentrating on its communications. The nasal cavity communicates superiorly with the nasal cavity, superiorly with the anterior cranial fossa, due to numerous cribriform foramina and sometimes the foramen cecum. In numerous manuals, you can find that on the lateral wall we have ethmoidal foramina. No ethmoidal foramina at all in the nasal cavity. So memorize it. But on the lateral surface is the sphenopalatine foramen. Sphenopalatine foramen that laterally leads to the nasal, to the pterygopalatine fossa, because the penultimate, the second last structure on the lateral wall is at the same time the medial wall of the pterygopalatine fossa. I mean the perpendicular plate of palatine bone and its sphenoidal process. So due to the sphenopalatine foramen, the nasal cavity joins the pterygopalatine fossa. Apart from this, just here, in the posterior part of the nasal cavity, we have two canals. More medial is vomerovaginal canal, and more lateral, the palatovaginal canal. The palatovaginal canal is constant, which does not refer to the vomerovaginal canal. If present, it joins the palatovaginal canal, and afterwards, the palatovaginal canal joins ends on the posterior wall of the pterygopalatine fossa, close to the sphenopalatine foramen. So the palatovaginal canal ends just between two walls of the pterygopalatine fossa. Can you see? Between the medial wall and posterior wall, just between both walls of the pterygopalatine fossa. And due to choanae, posterior nasal openings choanae, the nasal cavity communicates with the nasal part of the pharynx. And this is very important, how to bound each choana. So medially is the ala, vomerine ala. The vomerine ala, note, the vomer inferiorly is applied and positioned between two nasal crests that are formed by the medial raised borders of the horizontal plate of palatine bone. The inferior boundary is provided by the posterior border of horizontal palatine plate, and on the lateral border of either choana, we have the posterior free border of the medial pterygoid process, and here sphenoidal process of palatine bone. As you can see, the sphenoidal process of palatine bone arches superomedially, and so it's present in both the lateral and superior walls of the nasal cavity. Such a surface participating in the nasal cavity is inferomedial. Its superior surface, the superior surface of the sphenoidal process, is applied to the sphenoid's body, its underside, and the lateral surface, which is invisible here, because it's overlapped by the pterygoid process, contributes to the medial wall of the pterygopalatine fossa. So can you see? The sphenoidal process of palatine bone has three surfaces: inferomedial for the nasal cavity, superior for the sphenoid's body, and lateral for the pterygopalatine fossa. Just here, we can see that the medial pterygoid process inferiorly gives off a lateral curved process. So this is the hamulus, a small hook, while medially it forms the vaginal process. Both the hamulus and vaginal process are derivatives of the medial pterygoid plate. Just medial to the vaginal process is a groove completed by the vomerine alia. As a result, here is the vomerovaginal canal, and more laterally is because the inferior surface of the vaginal process, all of this is the vaginal process, has a groove, is grooved, sulcus, palatovaginal sulcus, and such a palatovaginal sulcus is completed inferiorly by the sphenoidal process of palatine bone. As a result, here we have the palatovaginal canal. The palatovaginal canal is a usual canal that's always present, and the inconstant vomerovaginal canal, if present, it joins the palatovaginal canal, and the palatovaginal canal just enters the pterygopalatine fossa between its medial and posterior walls. And so I think that's enough for today. Do you agree with me?
Yes, we can continue on Monday?
What do you think? It's very difficult. It is very difficult.
Yes, but we will study.
Yes. So study then.
Okay.
Thanks. See you on Monday then.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Bye.